UK. I welcome you all to the third phase of the International PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. The first and second phase of the series took place between May and December 2023. Students and staff from 8 disciplines, 22 universities, and 8 countries have participated in this series. The third phase started last week and will end in 2024, September 2024. We say thank you to the organizer of this weekly seminar series, Dr. Nauman Rayat, lecturer in law at Leicester Law School. He's the founder and convener of the Global South Net. Please allow me to introduce today's panel. I'm Dr. Margaret Gamberton. After working as a strategic communications officer for the US government, I studied politics at the University of York. I work on strategic narrative analysis and narrative warfare theory. I have a special interest in today's session as my younger son also works in the field of trans studies. I'll be chairing the session for you today. I'm joined by Dr. Vikram Visana, lecturer in Political School of History, Politics, and International Relations, University of Leicester. His research to date focused on Indian liberalism, with his first book, Uncivil Liberalism, Labor, Capital, and Commercial Society in Dadabhai Naoroji's Political Thought 2022, exploring the contribution of Indian liberalism to global ideas of sociality and political economy. His second book-length project has turned to a political emotion and republicanism in the political theory of the Global South, with a particular focus on humiliation as a form of political domination. Iona Mcentee is our peer commentator for today's session. She is the rep for postgraduate taught and research community of the Global South Network at the University of Strathclyde. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Strathclyde after completing the LLM in Global Environmental Law and Governance in 2020 and becoming a member of the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance in 2021. Iona has been developing her research within global environmental studies. Iona's research is grounded within the rights of nature discourse, with a focus on analyzing the extent to which interjudicial exchanges can accommodate the diffusion of subaltern epistemologies and act as a gradual and piecemeal approach towards the cosmopolitan transition of law. Last but not least, allow me to introduce our guest presenter, Somabha Bandopadhay. She is a teaching assistant at the West Bengal National University for Juridical Sciences, Kolkata, where she was formerly associated as a University Junior Research Fellow. She is an advocate at the Calcutta High Court and was awarded the Nani Palakilava Memorial Gold Medal at the National Law School of India, University Bangalore, for securing the highest LLM, human rights. Recently, Somabha has been awarded the Indo-Canadian Shastri Scholarship to pursue research on the victimization of transgender persons. Somabha won the prestigious Bar Council of India Inter-University Moot Court competition in 2017 and was judged the best speaker as well as the best female advocate, ensuring her a scholarship from the council for a year. Her paper, Agricultural Commons, Where Does India Stand?, was selected for presentation at the annual New York State Political Science Conference, Manhattan College, New York in 2020. Somabha was awarded the Best Paper Presentation at the Professor N.R. Madhava Menon Legal Conference held at the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences last year. She recently passed her PhD viva in December 2023. Somabha, I congratulate you on the behalf of the Global South Network. She is working on revisions to the PhD. Today, Somabha will present her project titled Violence, Victimization, and Human Rights of the Transgender Community, an empirical study with special reference to West Bengal, India. Somabha, you have 30 to 35 minutes for the presentation, which will be followed by 5 minutes for comments and questions from the discussant and peer commentator, and about 15 minutes of questions and answers by all attendees. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible.
You are.
but I think there's some issue, which is why I'm not visible, even though from my end, it shows that the camera is working, but I think I'll just go ahead with it in the interest of time. So I'll just try and share my screen, and let's see if it's visible. Can you just let me know if it is visible? Because is it visible?
Well, yeah. We can see us.
Yes.
On your screen.
So I think now.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to Professor Norman for giving this opportunity to share the work that I've been doing here in India, because the objective of the work has been to be able to reach out to a larger community than just the community that where I'm working. And this is really a platform where I believe I am able to, do it for possibly for the first time, apart from the presentation that I did while I was pursuing my comparative research at the University of Montreal, Canada. But this is really like the first time that I'm sharing the work that I did here in India. So before I kind of begin with the presentation, I want to show a couple of these newspaper clippings that I happened to come across. So this is a newspaper clipping from 2023, where in one of the provinces, two transgender persons were stabbed to death. The next one was again in 2023. This is November 2023, which is just a couple of months ago from today. And this one goes down to 2014, even before I really started doing my work for my PhD. So, which actually means that this again is another one from 2018. So these visuals only point at the fact that the transgender violence and victimization is a reality, and that it has been continuing in India for a very, very long time. And even though we have a legislation which was passed in the year 2019, we have really done nothing. We haven't achieved a lot about it, and that's exactly what my research was about. So, violence, victimization, and human rights of the transgender community, an empirical study with special reference to West Bengal was my research. And I looked at violence, I looked at victimization, which was not just maybe physical violence or sexual violence, but much more than that. And of course, overarching umbrella of my research was on the human rights of the transgender community. The reason I chose to work with the state of West Bengal is where I come from. That was one reason, because language barrier otherwise would have been a huge challenge for a country like India, where there are at least 100 dialects to one language itself. Apart from that, the reason I chose the state of West Bengal is because the province of West Bengal is because most of the revolutionary movements and libertarian movements that we have had in India, this province has been the pioneer of it, which was also the capital of the British rule for almost 200 years in India. So the background of this study was with the fact, and I deliberately quote the numbers from 2007 to 2014, 2019, to show how significant the work was when I really started off the work. So the numbers across the world, as were reported, of atrocities which were reported, these atrocities were either of violence or rape or murder or sexual violence, all those together. In 2019 alone, it was 350 individuals who were killed. And from 2007 to 2014, 1731 trans individuals were murdered, which apparently seems that it's not a huge number in comparison to the huge world that we are in. But when we look at the composition, which is the first point that I have mentioned, the composition is of 3% to 4%, or even certain research shows that even less. So when we look at such a small population, the atrocities which we then look at, and the numbers then when we look at it, I think it is quite significant. And the fact that it is quite significant, and it is just not me who is saying that, can be ascertained by the fact that in 2012, there was the first interministerial conference of parties at the UN. And subsequently, there has been in the year 2018 one special expert of the UN Human Rights Council that has been set up, which, and as I have quoted on my slide here, has mentioned about a global phenomena of violence against the community. And the reports have stated that there is grave concern over the violence to the community, and that trans movement has led to massive internationalization of their issues, which is where my research really began, by figuring out that there is some kind of a global phenomena of violence against transgender persons. And I tried to look at the Indian perspective to it. So NCRB, which is the National Crime Records Bureau of India, had recorded for the first time ever in the year 2018 that there were certain persons who were murdered who identified as transgender persons. But we have to remember here that in 2014, the Supreme Court of India had already come out with its decision which gave legal status to the transgender community in India. Despite that, it took 4 years for the National Crime Records Bureau to have a separate section to mention about transgender murders. But this has only been limited to transgender murders and has not been featured in any other offences. And there has been incongruency in data, which I found, which is what I have recorded in my submission as well, that the data that the government has shown is starkly different with regard to the data of independent research organizations which are there across the world, especially the United States of America. So we see that there is this contradiction in the number of, in the data when it comes to violence and victimization, and at the same time, there is very feeble recognition of the scenario across the world. And so when I looked at the statistical reality, this is what I could find. And we see from the very right side of the screen to the left side, if we look at the data like that, we see that there has been increase in the number of incidents of violence against the transgender persons across the world. And this is, again, as I said, this is one of the organizations which is an independent organization, Trans Respect versus Transphobia, who every year on the Trans Day of Remembrance comes up with the data. And this data is really alarming as regards how many people are facing murder and violence across the world. So this is really the context in which the research was undertaken. And we can, if we look at it very clearly, we see that on the left hand side, which is another data of the Trans Murdering Project, TMM, we see in 2022, 62% of those who had faced such violence were into sex work. 79% in the USA who were killed were of people of color. So there are these intersections also which exist, and that's what my research also briefly tried to look at. And so the statement of problem that I had for the research is something that I already explained through my introductory discussion that I had. But broadly, it was into these 5 or 6 groups. The first one being that the gender-based violence is rarely inclusive of the transgender violence. It is usually considered to be violence against women. The second being that there has been not a lot of intervention when it comes to the internationalization of the violence. Third is that they face the violence because they also constitute a group as such, which has not been really looked at. Finally, the concept of human rights regime, whether at all it is sufficient when it comes to protecting their rights or not, was something I was looking at, or whether we need some sort of a special mechanism to protect their rights was something I looked at. Finally, this was another very important dimension of my research, which was with regards to the gravity of the barbarism that has been that has been seen, and whether that gravity of barbarism can be correlated to the reporting of these crimes or not in India, and especially the province I was working in. Finally, the major issue with regards to transgender scholarship across the world has been with regards to clubbing of the LGBTQIA issues together. There have been a lot of scholarship that has constantly harped upon the fact that the issues of the transgender persons are very different from the issues of the other letters in the spectrum of LGBTQIA. And this is something which has led to the problems of the transgender persons really being going under the carpet. And that is why the research has been specifically on the transgender persons. So there were some gaps that I had identified in the research, which I believe would be a repetition of whatever I've been discussing as of now. So I'll just move on to the research questions that I had for the research, which was primarily to look at the transgender jurisprudence that has developed, because my research has been a socio-legal research. So I really looked at the transgender jurisprudence, wherein I looked at the case laws across the world protecting the rights of transgender persons, the different initiatives countries have taken, be it in terms of some policies or some laws that the countries have undertaken. Now, these were inclusive of legislations or court decisions which were pertaining to the protection against violence and victimization, as well as their human rights. So I was looking at both the civil rights angle as well as the protection against criminal wrong in this first or second chapter, so to say, of the development of the transgender jurisprudence. The second research was really about the different kinds of violence that they face and who are the primary partakers of this, and whether the Indian legal regime is cognizant and is adaptive enough to take care of that. The third was with regard to the reporting of the crimes as against the violence that happened against them. And the final fourth question was really on the victimological jurisprudence, where I looked at what about their victim status and whether India has any kind of protection mechanism to protect them against their victimization that they face. So accordingly, there were these 6 research objectives that I had. I looked at the evolution. Objective was to find out the kinds of atrocities and the persons involved, the Indian narrative of transgender violence and victimization, looking at the theoretical notions of victimization and compare it with trans victimization, and finally find out the criminality of the acts that are involved in this entire regime. And of course, in this my final objective really was to contribute or add some value to the developing jurisprudence on transgender rights in India, but sorry, not just India, across the world, but of course, with a legal perspective, something which was missing from the scholarship that I could which were at my disposal. So the research methodology that I used for this purpose was a mixed method, because I undertook empirical research in my province, and I of course did an extensive doctrinal research where I looked at several books, journal articles, which were very few though, and I looked at a lot of newspaper reportings, of which I just shared some of them at the very beginning of the presentation. Along with that, when I did my empirical research, the data has been presented in both quantitative as well as qualitative format. And in the quantitative format, I have used both graphical as well as statistical analysis. My empirical research has been through the snowball sampling technique, where I have surveyed 300 transgender persons in my state, which is 10% of the total population as recorded by the government through its census report of 2011, which even though is a backdated report, but backdated data, but we did not have another census in 2021 owing to the pandemic. So we are still awaiting the final census report, and that is why I could only do 300, which is 10% of the population in my province. Apart from that, I have done 31 qualitative interviews, which were in-depth interview schedules that I had used. These interview schedules were semi-structured in nature because I wanted to indulge into a conversation with my respondents. So these were the transgender respondents, who were 300 for surveys and 31 interviews. Apart from that, I had other stakeholders, which were judicial officers, with whom I did have I did have interviews, but they were all quantitative in nature. I interviewed 9 NGO representatives of the total about 17 or 18 total NGOs which are working in the state of West Bengal, in my province. And these were all qualitative interviews that I had undertaken. These were again semi-structured interviews. For the judicial officers, it was a structured interview though. From the police force, I could interview 5 police officers who were all ranked officials, which means that they were of the ranks, higher ranks, and not the ones not at the lower ranks. So there were 5 of them I interviewed, which was again qualitative in nature. It was semi-structured again. And finally, I interviewed 1 senior advocate of the Supreme Court of India, which was a qualitative interview. Out of the 22 districts or provinces in West Bengal, in my state, I covered 18 of them from West Bengal. The other 4 I wanted to do, but I could not get any access to those because of several issues, including most importantly the issue of openly recognizing or identifying oneself as a transgender person. So the chapterization that I had was something like this, as if we look at it from the left of the screen to the right. The first one was really giving some context to the problem that I am dealing with. Second one was on the transgender jurisprudence, the history, development, and intervention of the courts across the world. The third one was taking a bird's eye view of the global scenario of violence against transgender persons, wherein it was absolutely a doctrinal research being reflected through analytical research method. The fourth one was Indian scenario of violence, which was an empirical study of whatever I could do in West Bengal, a scenario of that. But this chapter was really on the violence part of it, because the next chapter was the second half of my empirical research, which was on victimization. So that chapter, which was chapter 5, was on human rights derogation and victimization of transgender persons, which was again the empirical data. But this was really the victimization part of it, which meant this included verbal abuse, economic abuse, financial abuse, and all of that. The next one was revelations from the field, wherein I was interpreting the qualitative and quantitative data in depth. And in this, I also, since I had used the observation method, I reflected upon those in this chapter. So this chapter is really the essence of the entire research that I have used. And finally, the conclusion and recommendation that I had. And so this was how my chapterization really went about. So the parameters that I use for the analysis, I will directly go into it so that I could get more insights from you on this. Of the interview schedules that I had for all the different stakeholders, how I categorized my analysis was in this manner. There were 5 clusters I made. So my questions were either to do with identifying the seriousness of the violence, or trying to understand the confidence in the police, or the legal awareness that the community had, or even judicial officers or police personnel had. The next was on the civil rights part of it, that is impact on education and livelihood. And finally, the last part was on government's ignorance and unawareness of the health scenario. So my questions were a mixed bag. So, but when I analyzed these questions, I discussed it under these broad clusters. And I did a color coding as well in order to understand how, or rather in order to kind of bifurcate the questions that I had. So if time permits, I would just like to show how I did the coding, and therein maybe you will be able to understand how I use the color coding as well, apart from the usual coding. So the findings which I had again were from the stakeholders, which were transgender persons and others. So I think I just explained that. If I have some time, maybe after I complete, I would like to go back to the quantitative as well as the qualitative part of it. For quantitative, as I said, for statistical purposes, I use SPSS because that is what we usually we usually use in India. So I used that, and for graphical, I used Excel itself to make the graphs and the pie charts and all of that. For qualitative, I did not run it through NVivo because that is something which is a very new kind of a phenomena in India, and it's very difficult to be able to do it. And honestly, I did not really have access to NVivo because our university is about to get that access. I didn't have it when I was doing the research, so I did not run it through NVivo or any other software. But I have done in-depth analysis again based on those color coding that I did. So I think I will not delve into these. I will just like try to flag it that these were the prior case laws I had for victimization to show, because because not all cases are reported in the in the reports that we have. Only those cases which go up till the High Court or the Supreme Courts get reported. The other cases which are before the local courts are not really reported. And in any case, at my province, there have been very few cases which have been reported. Most of them go to the police, and that's where it ends. So I have used all those instances that I came to know from the police or from the transgender respondents, and I have flagged it as a part of my qualitative research itself. But these are the three cases that I could find from the high courts, which is the provincial courts of different states of India, that I have used as the background for my research on victimization. So what I could understand from there, from all of this doctrinal research and the empirical research that I did, is that there are certain approaches which are possible for incorporating as the solution to the problem that I'm dealing with, which includes these 6 approaches, which is the victimization approach given by Richard Quinney, the hate crime approach, which has been given by Jeremy Kidd and some other scholars who had written an article on this. Mughal talks about the fact that we should go beyond a hate crime approach because there is no deterrence that comes from hate crime legislation. So we should think of something else, which is a human rights law kind of an approach flagged by Amnesty International. Samuel Singer, who is a transgender scholar from the University of Ottawa, whom also I had the pleasure of interviewing, and Doug Mayer, again another queer scholar, who talks about the fact that we should use the marginalization approach instead of using the human rights law approach, because the transgender community is a marginalized community. So we should be able to use the analogous interpretation and explanation of marginalization into this, so that we are able to solve the problem of transgender violence and victimization. Finally, Kendall talks about a more ambitious approach, which is of overhauling of political structure, which is something which I don't know how far it is true and how far it could be made possible at least in a country like India, or for that matter actually across the world, because it's very difficult to do a paradigm shift all in just overnightly. So these are the possible approaches that I could sense or I could get from my doctrinal research, which I feel could be used to solve the problem that I figured out from the empirical research. And
Somabha,
so yes.
Somabha, just a heads up, we have another couple of minutes for you to wrap up.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just at the end of the discussion. So the theorization that I could come up with is a kind of an approach where we begin with having a hate crime approach, which could then possibly finally lead to an approach of marginalization, which will be in recognition of the vulnerability and the victimization position. So, I think in a country like India, it has to happen step by step. And that is why my theorization was beginning with the hate crime approach, because we are really nowhere when it comes to protecting transgender violence and victimization in the country. Because even though we have the legislation, we have not been able to really protect the community. So I could figure out that there is this gap between the law, the implementation, actions, opinions, and really the realities, the ground realities. So from the finding that I had, I would say that the atrocities are very high, irrespective of the reporting statistics. Hence, there is an inverse proportion that is at work here. And that means we have to have a legislation, or at least some kind of amendments to the existing legislations, so that we can solve this problem of transgender violence and victimization. So these were the some summary of the findings, which of course I couldn't delve because of paucity of time. But what I can really reveal is the fact that we have not been able to protect the community much. And so these were my suggestions, and this is where I would end. That these are the suggestions I had that I could come up with regard to my research, and these were again clusters of the suggestions I had. And if it interests any one of you, I would be more than happy to give explanation to each of these suggestions that I had. But the suggestions went from legal to judicial to legal awareness to coordination and all of that together. So that is it, and thank you so much for giving this platform for me to be able to shed some light very quickly into the research that I have been pursuing for the last 3.5, 4 years. Thank you so much.
You're muted, Maggie. Sorry.
Apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, no. Oh, all right. Not that you wanted to. That was my timer. Okay. Vikram and Iona, over to you as a discussant and peer commentator.
Thank you. I have a few sort of brief questions. So thank you, Somabha. That was a really, really fantastic talk, and really, really important and worthwhile research, as you pointed out, because the sort of marginalization of transgender and gender fluid people around the world is such a major issue at the moment, and has become a peccadillo for right-wing politics and all that kind of stuff. So really, really valuable. I must confess, I'm not an expert either in the law or in specifically researching transgender and gender fluid issues, but I am a kind of researcher in Indian politics and political theory. So forgive me if my questions sort of sound like they're a bit more from my discipline than yours. But some of the things that kind of leaped out at me is that there is a need for legal reform in all these various kind of avenues that you described. I mean, how much of what needs to be untangled legally do you feel has a kind of colonial inheritance? Because there's a lot of work in the history of transgender rights in India about the British policing transgender people as a sort of particularly through prostitution and sexual panics and that kind of stuff. Does the contemporary Indian state have an inheritance around those sorts of issues that needs to be dealt with? And the other major question was, do you think existing legislation that at least attempts to protect caste victimization in India could in some ways be adapted to the transgender rights issue? Because I mean, there are some overlaps in the sense that transgender people are often forced to live in certain parts of the village or kind of outside the perimeters of the village and so on. There's issues of purity and pollution. There's issues of I know that hijra, third gender people, are sometimes invited to weddings to kind of celebrate, but then once that's over, you're outside. So it's this very kind of traditional caste-based relationship in some ways. And the third point was, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on this, is very anecdotal knowledge, but is it the case that Bangladesh, or East Bengal as it was, has slightly more progressive legislation than India and West Bengal on the transgender issue? So I think there's some small tokenistic attempts at affirmative action in Bangladesh, and I don't know whether you think that's surprising or not, but what perhaps explains the difference there?
So I think I will start with the last one first. The aspect of, so this is again because I'm discussing in this platform. So we know that in South Asia, the concept of transgender persons is really related to the hijra community. So that is again a very typical of South Asia and in fact Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia also we do have, for example, in Nepal we have the Metis community. In Vietnam we have some other communities. So and they are very much related to the culture of these countries, which is not the case in the Western world. So when we look at the legislations and look at the protection mechanism that should be available, it should be culturally sensitive and culturally relative to that, which is something which is missing, I would say, because Pakistan came up with a legislation much before us, I mean 1 year before us. Nepal came up with a judgment in 2014 or 2016 for protecting the Methi community. But the problem is that, these are, as you said, that these are only token initiatives that are done. And these mean nothing to the grassroots people. Because again, it's the same politics, that the people who are up in the ladder, the ones who are elitist, so to say, they are the ones who come to know of it, and they are the ones who can exercise their rights. So that, power dynamics again plays out for this community also. So the problem is, when we are trying to protect them through a legislation, which is where I'm coming to the second and the first point that you mentioned, when we are trying to protect them, they need to be protected in their own spirit and not in the spirit in which ultimately the government would get, a good name, so to say. So what we have been able to do is we have been able to have a legislation, which is what makes India come up in one of those few countries which have a specific legislation for protecting transgender persons. But we do not do anything with it. And why I say so is because the legislation that we have attempts to be a special law, but it fails to protect specially the transgender persons who face immense violence and victimization. Because the special law does not even have the similar provisions for or similar penal provisions for perpetrators of violence and victimization, which is even there in our general law. So I'll just give an example. If you commit a rape of a woman, as per the general law, there would be life imprisonment. And if it's a child, it can go up to 20 years with the new modifications. But if it's a transgender person who is facing that kind of a violence, if we are relying upon the only law in India, the punishment is maximum 2 years. Now, so the problem is, can you use this legislation for protecting them? You cannot, because the Indian Penal Code is very much centered around a woman. So transgender rape is not covered. And then again, when you look at this law, which is supposedly for the protection of the trans persons, trans rape is not even covered. And even if you try to use sexual assault as trans rape, at least to give some protection, the maximum protection that you have is for 2 years. So, there is no government will or government intent, I would say, for the purposes of protecting the rights of transgender persons. And, I will not at all hesitate to keep saying this because I have a lot of friends now in the community, of whom so many of them have to constantly go to the provincial courts to get an order from the court to even file government application forms with their transgender identity. And to give an anecdote, someone who is appearing for the judicial exams had to actually go before the high court or the provincial court of my province to get an order from the court so that the person could apply as a trans person and not just as a male or a female. Even though the 2014 legislation has already given them their right so long ago. So that's why, the government is not really willing. I mean, it's like an eye wash, I would say. It's like an eye wash. Now, and I think finally, to answer with regard to the caste aspect that you mentioned, while there are a lot of overlaps, but I think the issue is that with regard to caste, there is a kind of movement progress that we have already made. But with regard to the transgender protection, the stigma still lurks. And nobody wants to talk about it. Today, we see a lot of people taking pride in identifying in the caste that they are. But it is still a taboo to be able to recognize openly in several parts of the country as a trans person. So I think there itself, while we can definitely draw the analogy of the victimization they face, But when it comes to really having a law which could be implemented and they could be benefited, we need to have a segregated approach, because it's not the same that we see for the ones who face caste violence.
Great, thank you, Somabha. That's all of the questions I had to ask, but they were very, very fully answered.
Thank
So
you.
over to Iona.
Great. Yeah, no, I just wanted to reiterate as well, I thought it was a great presentation. It's not an area of research that I know very well, so it was quite enlightening. So yeah, it was great. So I just have a couple of questions, and it's probably coming more from the sort of like legal aspect, because that's, you know, more of my expertise anyways. And because in my own research as well, India is one of my case studies, but from a different perspective. So I had a couple of questions with regard to that. So in my own research, when I've been researching, I've been noticing that, you know, Indian courts have typically designated themselves as activist courts in a lot of areas, especially in environmental areas, you know, the creation of like the National Green Tribunal and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering if in your own research, you're also seeing this sort of activism within the courts, within LGBTQI plus situations, or and specifically in trans related issues, if this court activism is still quite apparent. Secondly, I was wondering, so you've talked about how the 2019 Act, you know, although maybe it seems great on paper, you know, in practice didn't provide the substance, which I think can be said for a lot of pieces of legislation and more. So I was just wondering, why do you think there has been, you know, these significant gaps in that regard? Has it been the legacy of, you know, ineffective colonial structures? So what are sort of the gaps are there? And then building upon that, I was wondering, do you then think in the absence of effective and efficient national legislation to provide these protections, is there then a bigger role for international law in this situation? So you spoke about, you know, using it through a human rights lens. So will human rights therefore play a bigger role in, you know, protecting the rights of people from this community? And then lastly, just to, you know, pile up the questions,
Yes.
I was just wondering, it was about your methodology, because I found it quite interesting. I mean, especially, you know, access to these participants. I thought you had, like, it was quite a big group of people. So I think you said like 300 people, which is, it's amazing. But I was just wondering about the ethics in that. Did you find when gathering this sort of group, was it quite difficult? You know, just sort of like, what was your experience? I think especially with the increasing numbers, especially from 2018 to 2019, there was actually an increase that you said in your statistics from for trans violence. And then so I was wondering, did you have difficulty getting people coming forward to collect this data out of, you know, fear and just sort of, you know, not being protected by the law? So just wondering how was your process with that as well?
I think again I will start with the last one, because that's like something that goes down to my experience sharing, so what I did. So I would just begin by saying that I think I was more scared of the COVID-19 than anything else, because when I interviewed these 300 people, it was 2021, which was the second wave of COVID-19. I mean, we had just ended COVID-19 second wave in India, and it was, we all know what the world went through. And that's when my supervisor asked me to simply go to the field and start collecting data. So you imagine I interacted with 300 people, and 300 people meant another 100 people who were otherwise involved. We're starting from the people who took me, the NGO representatives, the driver, you know, the people who would serve tea and all of it. So, you know, it was like I interacted with almost 400 people. And that was the most, that was the toughest thing that I faced. And that was also a hurdle, because a lot of people would not really come out and would want to chat with me, because they would be fearful of contracting the virus. Now coming to the ethics part of it. So in India, you know, when it comes to empirical research, scientific research, or sociological research, we have some protocols to follow. But unfortunately for legal research, we don't have a lot of protocols to follow as of now. And that's a very sad part. which is why, when we do social legal empirical research, it is kind of unregulated. But I came to know this when I was undergoing my PhD coursework. And coming from a background, where my family background is really into academia, so I knew that it's not in legal research. I mean, for sociological research, we have this ethical guidelines. So I tried to follow it as much as possible. So I read a lot of scholarship on ethics and, what do you do, all of that. But, I honestly couldn't take any declaration forms like, we usually do, something that I did when I did my research in Canada. I couldn't do that because in India, people would be simply scared and would feel intimidated if I would, go around taking a signature. But what I did was I did have an orientation with all of them before I started my interviews. And even when I would start my interview, I would give them an orientation stating that it is on your volition that you want to do it. If you want to recuse, you can still recuse and all of that. And I actually recorded all of it. But again, because of the ethical considerations, I cannot share it, but then it's going to be with me and it's in a protected, folder. It's there. Also, I did the coding in a manner that, I had a separate document where I coded their names. So the interview forms, if anyone would like to have access, can have access to them because those only have codes. They don't have the names. So the names are on a different folder, which is with me. So that's how I really tried to do it. I actually sat down with a lot of social scientists who do such research with vulnerable communities. And I spent a lot of time in formulating the methodology that I would follow. So I can say that, at least I have tried to be 90% very ethical when it comes to the research with the vulnerable community, because, I didn't have a template to follow. So I made my own template and something that I shared with the present PhD scholars at my university. Now, so coming to your question
Somabha,
about...
You've been...
Yeah. Yes.
We have only a few minutes left. You're doing an extraordinary job of answering your respondents' questions, but I would like to be able to save just a little time to throw the questions open to the other participants. So,
okay, sure.
If you could just summarize that.
Yes. So I think I'll just address one question that has been raised by Iona, and maybe later, we could discuss after the time if you want to stay back. So that is with regard to the government's why is it like that? I think, the government somehow doesn't want, because this is not on the government's agenda. This is not something that's going to give them a lot of votes. This is not something that is going to take, going to be of a lot of, a value. It's not a very big agenda. And that's why I think we are suffering from that problem. But nevertheless, the government has done something in the sense of bringing this legislation and certain policies in place. But, it's more of a bucket list, really. But I can understand in a country like India, it's difficult. And finally, yes, to answer your question, courts have been really active. And I just gave the example while answering to Dr. Vikram, that courts have really ensured that the rights are protected of the transgender persons in several forms, even during COVID. Yes.
Thank you so much for such incredibly detailed, interesting, and on-point answers. I'm throwing the floor open for just a few minutes because we've run long. Does anyone else have a question for Somabha? Okay, you all, let's see. Who would like to talk? Pavitra, would you go ahead?
Yeah. Hi there, Somabha. Thank you so much for this really interesting and very important and crucial, critical presentation and your work. We don't have enough people really advocating for trans people. Is so important. So I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm very aware of time. So the one question that I will ask you is, when we talk about empirical research a lot, there is a tendency to separate or prioritize detachment on the field when you're working with people. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how your work impacted you, like engaging with these people, particularly when you're going into the police stations. I don't know if you went to the police station to talk to police officers, or because I know from having gone into police stations in Tamil Nadu, where I'm from, that it's not really safe. So I just also wondered, because this is a really critical topic, it does have an impact. So from an autoethnographical perspective, whether you would just consider sharing your emotions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for asking that. I think, it's like people who work who face the same trauma and problem would be able to ask such a question. So, well, I would say that I was actually shooed away by one of the superintendent of police. This was in one of the districts in West Bengal. And I did write about it in my thesis as well. And that also happened because I had about 4 or 5 transgender persons who were, openly dressed with me. So he kind of just shooed us away. So while that happened, I actually got a lot of support from several other officers. And that's why I said that, I could interview high-ranked officials. So I really would want to continue the research where I interview the ones who are in the lower ranks, because most of the violence is actually, police violence is actually committed by the constables, the police drivers, all those OCs and all of those. But it's a sensitive issue, which is why I couldn't really interview them. But I have used my observation method when I conducted police trainings, which I do even now. So that is why my research is kind of an ongoing process, because I try to understand how do they react through the observation that I do when I'm doing these doing these training programs. So it is, of course, intimidating, and it is a lot of trouble. There would be nights where I would actually get these nightmares, and also constantly being in touch with people who are facing so much of trauma and who share such experiences, which is just so gruesome. It gets onto you, and it was COVID-19 all the more. So I think I think that trauma still is there in the subconscious for me, but which is why maybe it's there in the work that I'm doing, and I'll continue doing so.
Somabha, to conclude, thank you to Dr. Nauman for inviting me to chair this session. Thank you, Somabha, for a truly wonderful presentation. It was a great contribution to discourse on the Global South in general and on the rights of the trans community in India in particular. Thank you, Dr. Vikram Visana and Iona Mcentee, for insightful comments and questions. Thank all of you for attending this session. The next time, same time next week, we'll have Christiana Barao, PhD candidate, School of Law, University of Ilorin, Nigeria, who's going to present her project titled Critical Appraisal of the Provisions of the Disability Law in Nigeria and the Challenges in Their Implementation, a case study of Niger State. I encourage all of the attendees today to attend this next session, and that will take place on Wednesday, the 30th.